Hello once again, and welcome to another edition of the SaskAgToday.com Roundtable. I'm joined by the Chief Agricultural Editor of SaskAgToday.com, Kevin Hursh, as well as the Agri-News Director for 620 CKRM Regina, Ryan Young. I'm Doug Falconer, Agriculture Director at GX94 in Yorkton. And first of all, gentlemen, the big news on Monday was $12 billion worth of aid for American farmers, but U.S. President Donald Trump also threw out the idea of perhaps imposing some tariffs on fertilizer from Canada heading south. Ryan, you had a chance to follow up on some of that audio?
Yeah, absolutely. Just kind of focusing on the fertilizer tariffs first. It's not entirely new. He did kind of speak about that before, and actually, at one point, there was tariffs on Canadian fertilizer, specifically on potash. That was about 10% before that eventually went away. But nevertheless, farmers still dealt with, high fertilizer prices as a result. And that got people talking then. And then when he mentioned it on Monday, people were talking about it not long after. When I talked to Bill Przybylski this week, the president of APAS, he obviously had his concerns, about maybe farmers could potentially cut back on fertilizer as a result of the tariffs, should they come to fruition, and that could have a ripple effect into the harvest season next year. But he said we're kind of a long way from that, so while concerning, we'll just kind of wait and see if it comes to fruition or not. Premier Scott Moe also talked about the fertilizer tariffs. He was asked about it, and he pretty much said similar things. In fact, he borrowed a quote from Jean Chrétien where he said, you take the president seriously, but not literally. So obviously, Scott Moe is also concerned about it, but he also said, too, that, that would drive up the costs for American farmers, and that's something that the president would not want to do since he will want to keep support of the American farming community. So this is just another case of throwing, a hot button opinion out there and seeing what happens. And, kind of at this point, we're already accustomed to, all these tariff threats. So it could be just a case of, he's full of it, just saying stuff, seeing if people get intimidated, but just dismissing it.
Kevin, your thoughts on that comment about potash tariffs against Canadian potash heading to the States?
Well, it's strange to be announcing $12 billion in support for American farmers, and most of the analysis or most of the reaction in the U.S. is, well, this helps stop the bleeding, but really the drop in income is greater than $12 billion. And at the same time, talk about putting tariffs on incoming fertilizer, which makes very little sense when you analyze it. There's no established domestic supply of potash in the U.S., so they'll need to get it from somewhere. So that just drives up prices for the farmers that you're supporting with billions of dollars. It really harkens to, did an interview this week with Carlo Dade, who's with International Policy, University of Calgary, and he calls it weaponized uncertainty, that these tariffs have been announced and changed and announced again, and businesses can react if they know what the rules of the game are and decide whether or not you can still do a business with the U.S. with a tariff in place. But when there's so much uncertainty, that's really hard on businesses. And he doesn't expect this policy to change when Donald Trump leaves office in 3 years' time. He believes it's ingrained in American policy, and they're using it to get their way in trade deals.
Something else that came out this week was the Manitoba Agriculture Department released their crop insect report for 2025. And they suggested that grasshoppers and aphids weren't a big deal this year. That sounds not an awful unlike Saskatchewan, but they did have issues for canola fields with the cabbage, seed pod weevil, flea beetles, Bertha armyworms, and diamondback moths. Does that sound like pretty much the same thing as Saskatchewan, Kevin?
Well, it's interesting that they're finally getting cabbage seed pod weevils into Manitoba. Really, this was something that came out of southern Alberta and moved into the west side of Saskatchewan and can be a problem in both canola and mustard crops, at least brown and oriental mustard crops in Saskatchewan, and something that producers have come to monitor for here, but really hadn't really spread as far as Manitoba. So this is interesting that they're getting instances of some fairly high counts in some parts of Manitoba. Shows how a pest can spread, or how pests can really be reliant on the weather and growing conditions that change from one year to the next.
Also this week, the Bank of Canada left their interest rate unchanged. Ryan, you had a chance to speak with Adam Picallo on that.
Yeah, he was one of many that wasn't surprised by the Bank of Canada's decision to keep their interest rate where it is at. Kind of fell in line with economists' expectations, and a lot of the decision making behind that was inflation and other core economic numbers falling within the central bank's expectations. Job numbers, GDP growth. They expect, they being the central bank, expecting GDP growth to kind of go down a little bit towards the fourth quarter of this year, but pick back up in 2026. And Picallo said, at this point, with all that considered, the central bank might be done, cutting rates for now, just to see how the economy responds, and to try and guess where it would go in 2026. That's anybody's guess. It's kind of an unknown at this point, so we'll see where that goes. But like I said, with Adam, it wasn't a surprise.
And Kevin, this really doesn't have much of an impact on the rank and file farmer out there?
No, steady as she goes at this point, but as Ryan said, where it goes next year is anyone's guess. A lot of analysts believe there will be further drops next year, but really it's going to depend on economic conditions and how it all plays out, and that becomes very difficult to predict.
Also this week, the United States Department of Agriculture released their World Agricultural Supply and Demand estimates. Corn ending stocks in the U.S. will be tighter than earlier expected. The soybean ending stocks were unchanged, and wheat carryout was unchanged as well, but global corn ending stocks were cut. Soybean ending stocks were raised, and world wheat carryout was also up. Do those numbers have much of an impact on us here in Canada, Kevin?
Well, when we look at our numbers, and Chuck Penner of Left Field Commodity Research gave a market analysis at the Canary Seed Development Commission of Saskatchewan's annual meeting held this week in Regina, and I watched in virtually to see Chuck's presentation. And in one of his slides, he had the caption, "How many ways can you say burdensome?" And certainly when we look at a lot of the Canadian supplies and relate them to world supplies, whether they're whether world supplies are up or down a little bit, it's still a very burdensome situation in most crops. And looking specifically at canary seed, if we didn't grow any canary seed next year in Saskatchewan, we'd have enough canary seed to supply the market. The carryover is projected to be something like 120%. So more than an average crop is going to be left over after this marketing year. And all of the other crops are maybe not quite as extreme as that, but everything else in many cases is in burdensome supply, and that means the price outlook is pretty muted for a lot of commodities.
Another big piece of news this week was the cabinet shuffle in Saskatchewan. And Ryan, of course, you had a bit of an inkling that we might have a new agriculture minister, since an interview you had lined up with the previous agriculture minister suddenly fell through.
Yeah, that was. I had an interview set up with Daryl Harrison for Wednesday afternoon, and I was all ready to go. And the morning of, I got an email from one of the assistants saying that he's unavailable this week. Not only that day, but for the entire week. And it kind of threw me through a loop. I was like, oh, that's weird. Like, why is that? Like, I thought maybe at first, like, he was on vacation or something, wanted to take a little bit of a break before, doing year-end interviews and stuff. And then we found out yesterday that there was going to be a cabinet shuffle. So then the next thought was, oh, well, that might be the reason why, and it turned out to be the case. So David Merritt is back in as Agriculture Minister, replacing Daryl. David Merritt was the Ag Minister previously from 2018 to November of last year when Daryl took over. And Daryl obviously being the Ag Minister for 1 calendar year, so not a whole lot of time in the file. And kind of try to summarize his tenure, I would say kind of quiet, shall we say. Kind of looking back on his time, whenever the issues of, canola tariffs, for example, came up, it usually wasn't Daryl Harrison talking about the issue. It was usually somebody else, like the premier or even the finance minister. I heard in question period one day talking about, foreign farmland ownership, when it kind of thought, well, isn't that the ag minister's kind of field or purview to talk about these things? But nonetheless, there was always somebody else talking for Daryl. And I don't mean to as that as a slight, but that's just something I've observed over this past year. So all the best to Daryl Harrison and what he's going to be doing. He's still in government, but he's expected to just stay as the chair of one of the legislative committees. And David hopping back into the ag portfolio at a time when we're still dealing with tariffs and tariff threats from the U.S., and we'll see how he addresses those in the future.
Kevin, your reaction to the news that Daryl Harrison is out as Agriculture Minister in Saskatchewan and David Merritt is back in?
Well, I'm sure it was the fear of doing a year-end interview with Ryan that caused Daryl Harrison to withdraw from being Ag Minister. But no, seriously, that was really surprising. And that's the shortest tenure of any Ag Minister I can remember in the history of Saskatchewan. Maybe there's one out there, but none that I can remember in my time watching the file. And I think we have to assume that the Premier wanted someone with more experience in the ag portfolio and put David Merritt back into that position. David Merritt was very highly regarded in the many years he spent as Agriculture Minister, and is very well connected across the industry. So I think there will be comfort in having David Merritt there. Still, though, a surprise to see such an abrupt change.
All right, and finally, the Saskatchewan Water Security Agency put out their conditions at freeze-up report for 2025 on Friday, and probably one of the main things they suggested was that at freeze-up, soil moisture levels are near adequate in eastern areas of the Saskatchewan grain belt, while western areas and the north are exhibiting soil moisture deficits. Does that surprise you, Kevin?
No, I think that would be consistent with everything we've seen for precipitation maps, those coming out of SaskAg and those that are posted by Environment Canada. So I think in very broad terms, they've got it right. The western side of Saskatchewan is really going to be looking for moisture. The east has got a little bit more money in the bank in soil moisture going into the upcoming growing season.
Of course, Kevin, you reside in Saskatoon for the most part. Is there much snow in Saskatoon right now?
Actually, there was. I was down to the farm and down to Swiftcart this week, and just a tiny bit of snow there at the time I left. Now, they might have gotten more snow in the last little while, but Saskatoon actually had a fair dump of snow in a couple of different days. So there was shoveling on the streets and a little bit of difficulty on some of the roads. So it's certainly looking and feeling a lot like winter. Then a big warm-up supposedly happening, so never a dull moment.
And Ryan, how about the Regina area? Do you have much snow on the ground there?
We do. We got a good, decent shot of snow here the other day. I'd say at least a couple of centimeters. And before that, we just had enough snow to just cover the grass, where you just know and acknowledge that winter has arrived and it's not very dry. So, yeah, we've had a little bit of snow here. And Doug, I could imagine you guys got quite a bit as well.
Yeah, actually 2 weeks ago today, so that was Friday, November 28th, we had nothing, zero. And then we had a little bit overnight that night of the November 28th, and it's been snowing about every day or every second day ever since. So we've got a a pretty decent amount of snow on the ground here. It's not heavy, wet snow. It's that powder that it's pretty easy to shovel. And I'm sure the skiers will be happy about. But for those of us trying to get around the city, it's all sorts of fun right now. So on that note, that'll do it for this week's edition of the SaskAgToday.com Roundtable. On behalf of 620 CKRM Regina Agri-News Director Ryan Young and the Chief Agricultural Editor for SaskAgToday.com, Kevin Hursh, I'm GX94 Yorkton Agriculture Director Doug Falconer saying so long until next time.